everybody, we're going to talk about fluid electrolyte balance beginning in your course pack on page 121. In this video, we're going to talk about the review of osmosis and filtration reabsorption. These are topics you may have learned in previous courses or even in this course. Just a good reminder here to begin with is that we have about 25 liters or so of fluid in our bodies, and 2/3 or 66% of that fluid is stored inside cells. We call this fluid inside cells intracellular fluid, or ICF for short. The other 1/3 or 33% of the bodily fluids are stored outside cells as extracellular fluid. Most of that fluid is in interstitial fluid compartments as IF or as blood plasma. So we're going to take a review of bulk fluid transport at capillaries. You may recall there's two battling pressures for fluid movement in a capillary. And capillaries are the ideal location for fluid movement because they are made up of simple squamous epithelial tissue. Most capillaries are also porous. That makes it easy for fluids to escape and for them to be reabsorbed. Let's talk about the two types of pressures that you see here. You see a pressure called BHP, which stands for blood hydrostatic pressure. It is the same thing as blood pressure. Now, BHP, or blood hydrostatic pressure, is made by water pushing against the walls of our capillaries. So this particular pressure is a pushing force, pushes against the walls of these capillaries. The battling pressure here is BOP. Osmotic pressure is the pressure created by solutes and proteins in a fluid. So let's make note of that. BOP is created by solutes and proteins. And of course, water is attracted to the higher concentration of solutes or proteins. So this is a pulling pressure. Okay, so it battles against the hydrostatic pressure. Now, let's talk about what's happening along the length of our capillary. At the arterial end of our capillary, you'll notice that blood hydrostatic pressure is around 35 millimeters mercury. The pulling pressure, the osmotic pressure, is only 26 millimeters. In fact, it tends to stay stable across the length of the capillary. So you'll notice at the venial end, it's still 26 millimeters mercury. Now, the higher pressure wins the battle. So hydrostatic pressure at 35 millimeters mercury is the pressure of pushing or forcing water out of the capillary. So we end up having a flow of water from the capillary first to the interstitial space and then into the cell. So we call this movement of fluids out of the capillary filtration. Let's take a look at this NFP number. This is the one you need to know here. You'll notice the net filtration pressure is 10. Now, if you take 35 for the blood hydrostatic pressure and subtract blood osmotic pressure of 26, you're only going to get 9. So there is a small bit of pressure out here in the interstitial fluid for osmotic pressure and hydrostatic pressure. That's where the 10 number comes from, is we take into consideration those small pressures in the interstitial fluid. Now, if you imagine a garden hose that leaks and allows fluids to flow out into your garden, that's kind of how the capillary works. Fluids flow out along the length of your capillary into the interstitial space. But in doing so, we lose our hydrostatic pressure. You'll notice at the venial end of the capillary, blood hydrostatic pressure has dropped. It's now between 15 and 17 millimeters mercury. But osmotic pressure tends to stay stable. That's dependent upon the number of solutes and proteins in your bloodstream. So now, osmotic pressure tends to be the winner. It is the higher of the two pressures. So instead of forcing fluids out, we now can reabsorb those fluids back in. So this process driven by osmotic pressure at the venial end of your capillary is called reabsorption. Now, take a look at your NFP down here. It's a -8, and that is because osmotic pressure is a negative pressure. Fluids are being pulled in against the force of hydrostatic pressure. Like we discussed at the arterial end of the capillary, you can't simply say 26 minus 17 because that does not give you 8. Once again, take into account the small pressures out here in the interstitial space. You do have some osmotic and hydrostatic pressure to account for. Okay, so this should give us a review of what was discussed back in the blood vessels chapter with filtration and reabsorption. The numbers you'll want to know here are NFP, net filtration pressure. Under normal circumstances, we're looking at 10 on the arterial end and -8 on the venial end. One thing to make note of, we are pushing out fluids that we don't entirely reclaim back. If we were reclaiming back all of our fluids, the NFP at the venial end would also be -10. So that means that reclaiming about 90% of our fluids to reabsorption, the other 10% is hanging out in the interstitial space. So we must use our lymphatic system to help pick up those remaining fluids. Otherwise, the fluids accumulate in the interstitial space and you can get a condition that's called edema. So edema means there are extra fluids in the interstitial space. This image here just reminds us that we're not only talking about fluid exchanges between the blood and the interstitial space, that's out here. This reminds us we're also talking about the exchange of fluid between the interstitial space and the cell. If you'll turn on over to page 122 with me, let's talk through 3 forms of dehydration: isotonic, hypotonic, and hypertonic dehydration. So dehydration is a loaded word. It actually means loss. And before you stepped foot in this class today, you might have thought that dehydration simply meant the loss of water. But dehydration can also mean the loss of solutes or proteins from the bloodstream as well. So just something to appreciate, that dehydration can mean more than just simply water loss from the bloodstream. Something else to take a look at is isotonic has the prefix iso, which you may have learned means same. Back in Bio 210, you may have learned that cells placed in isotonic fluids would have no net change of water movement into or out of that cell. Likewise, this what we're talking about here. We're talking about an equal or same loss of water and salt from the bloodstream, which will cause no net movement or no net change in the movement of water into and out of that capillary. Most of our examples here are one-off events, just a single instance of diarrhea, vomiting, fasting, or bleeding. If you continue any of these for more than a single event, most of them can become cases of hypotonic dehydration. So the clue words to look for to determine isotonic dehydration are same or equal loss of salts in water. It has to be both salt solutes in water or proteins in water, because that means we're losing both blood osmotic pressure and blood hydrostatic pressure at the same time. Okay, so that's critical. Let's take a look at this image and work through how this would happen. So with isotonic dehydration, what are we losing? We're losing both hydrostatic pressure and osmotic pressure. So let's just play with our numbers. Let's knock our hydrostatic pressure down to 30 and our osmotic pressure down to 20. Which pressure here is normally responsible for filtration? That's hydrostatic pressure. Is it still the higher of the two numbers? At 30? Yes, it is. So we can still perform filtration at the arterial end of the capillary. Let's knock these numbers down as well. Let's say we put our osmotic pressure at 20, and let's say that we've taken our hydrostatic pressure down to 10 to 12. Now, at the venial end of your capillary, which pressure is primarily responsible for reabsorption? Normally it's BOP. So can we still reabsorb at the venial end of your capillary? Absolutely. So even though we've lost both hydrostatic and osmotic pressure, we're still able to do this mechanism of pushing fluids out into the interstitial space and reabsorbing them back in toward the venial end. So one-off events like diarrhea, vomiting, fasting, and bleeding are what we classify as isotonic dehydration because there is no net overall change in the way the fluids move into and out of the capillary. Let's also talk about hypotonic dehydration. Again, dehydration here means loss, but we have to be careful. What are we losing this time? We're losing solutes and proteins. So which pressure is that? Is that BHP or BOP? That's BOP. Another thing to keep in mind is this prefix hypo means below. And of course we know that cells bloat when placed in hypotonic solutions because they have below or less than the normal number of concentrated ions such as solutes or proteins. Let me share with you a helpful hint. The word hypo has an O. That means that the BOP is the one that's lost. We've lost solutes or salts and proteins. Here are more O's. And in this situation, we know that cells may bloat. I don't advocate memorizing your way through this content, but at least this is a starting point to make sure that you're getting it right every time. Now, take a look here at the problems we've got. I would not memorize this list of causes, but look at what they all have in common. Here's low sodium. Here's loss of proteins, more loss of proteins and sodium. Only one of these stands out as not fitting the normal trend, and that is the second one here, hypotonic drip or water intoxication. So let's talk about how this works by using a picture. We're going to pick one of these as an example. Let's use liver disorders, loss of proteins from the bloodstream, and walk through how that happens. Now, since hypotonic dehydration is a loss of solutes and proteins, we know the specific pressure that is influenced is blood osmotic pressure. So I'm going to leave alone the blood hydrostatic pressure, and I'm going to knock down the blood osmotic pressure to a really low number. Let's knock it down to 10 on each end of our capillary. So normally at the venial end of the capillary, we are filtering fluids out. Can we still do that? Absolutely. That hydrostatic pressure is still high enough in order for us to force fluids out of the capillary. At the venial end of the capillary, which pressure is typically responsible for reabsorbing fluids? Normally it's BOP, but notice BOP is now lower than BHP. So we're unable to force fluids out, or rather we're unable to pull fluids in, we're just able to force fluids out. So there is no reabsorption here. We're only doing filtration. So notice, where we're pushing fluids along the entire length of this capillary is into the interstitial space first. That interstitial space will swell. That's a problem we call edema. The fluids here become hypotonic, and that will then force fluids into the cell, and the cell will now bloat. Okay, so in order to fix this problem, you need to introduce more solutes or proteins into the bloodstream to fix this balance at the venial end and allow for fluids to then be reabsorbed. Keep in mind, your lymphatic vessel down here can only do so much, so it can only carry off a certain amount of fluids per day. So even though it's helping to pick up these escaped fluids, it's not going to be the solution to this problem. This image shows pitting edema, which happens when you place a thumb into a swollen leg or arm. A pit is left behind because there's so much fluid in the interstitial space. Okay, so this is hypotonic dehydration, and it's due to a loss of osmotic pressure or solutes and proteins from the bloodstream. If you'll flip on over with me to the next page, we will now talk about hypertonic dehydration. That's found on the top of page 123. Again, dehydration means loss. This time we're talking about the loss of water. And we know hypertonic means above, so we're talking about solutions that are more concentrated than they should be. So again, BHP is our issue. We're losing our hydrostatic pressure or the force to push fluids out of our capillary. Salt may be normal, but if you lose the water, the salt becomes more concentrated. Let's pretend that sodium and water are on a seesaw. Okay, so if I lose water, that is going to push sodium levels up. So losing water is in effect the same thing as gaining sodium in terms of blood concentration of salt. And that is in fact what we see here. A lot of these problems look at an increase of sodium and not so much a loss of water. There's a few here that have to do with loss of water, especially these two forms of diabetes. So I just want to make the point that just because you're losing water also means that you could be gaining salt. Not that you're taking in more necessarily, but the concentration becomes imbalanced. So let's pick a problem off that page. Let's talk about having, say, diabetes mellitus. Diabetes of any form will cause fluid to be lost from the bloodstream. So let's knock down our hydrostatic pressure. If we're losing BHP, then let's knock this number down really low. Let's say down to 20. And let's leave it there somewhere in the teens. So normally we expect to see fluids being filtered and forced out at the arterial end of the capillary. But this time you'll notice that hydrostatic pressure is the higher of the two numbers. So osmotic pressure is the higher of the two numbers. Osmotic pressure is going to force fluids back into the capillary. So that process we call reabsorption. Take a look at the venial end of the capillary. Still, osmotic pressure is the higher of the two. We continue reabsorption at the venial end of our capillary. So the first fluid compartment we access outside the bloodstream is interstitial fluid. It moves into the capillary. That space becomes hypertonic. Now fluids move from the cell into the interstitial space. So eventually, cells will shrivel as we lose fluids into the bloodstream. So imagine this. Fluids are moving from the interstitial space and the cells into the capillary, going to the kidney. The kidney sees all this extra fluid coming through, excretes it into urine, and unfortunately, that's how these cells become dehydrated. So drinking salt water, having diabetes, these are all great examples of hypertonic dehydration because we're talking about the loss of water primarily, and that's the loss of BHP from the bloodstream. Here's an example of what happens when someone is dehydrated due to hypertonic dehydration. The skin that's pulled up is left puckered, and we say that the skin has been left tinted up. On the bottom of page 123, let's talk about overhydration or hypotonic hydration. This is the gain of something, and in fact, it's the gain of excess water. So which pressure is influenced by water? Is it BHP or BOP? It's BHP. So let's go back to our seesaw for just a moment. We know that sodium and water are riding a seesaw. That means they're in a balance with each other in the bloodstream. So now if I'm gaining water in the bloodstream, that's going to decrease the amount of sodium that I have. So you may not be changing your sodium levels, but simply by the fact of taking in excess water, we're going to see a decrease in the sodium concentration in the bloodstream. And so that decreased sodium is called hyponatremia. So in these cases, we look like we've got great blood pressure. Blood pressure is up, right? Because we're increasing our blood hydrostatic pressure. Low blood pressure is actually the stimulus for ADH and aldosterone to be released. So high blood pressure is going to shut off those two. That means that we lose those excess fluids in our urine. Now, if you're taking in a lot of water over a short period of time, you may recall that the kidneys have a speed at which they operate. We call that the glomerulus filtration rate, or GFR. They can only filter about 120 milliliters per minute. Any more fluid than that, they just simply operate at that speed. So let me give you an example. If you go out on a hot summer day and you work in the yard for several hours and you don't stay properly hydrated by drinking every so often, you may come in the house later in the day parched. At that point, if you pick up some fluids like water, a soft drink, or even tea, these are all hypotonic fluids. You may drink a lot of them in a short period of time. Now, the problem is your kidneys only filter 120 milliliters of blood per minute. So if you've had a liter of fluid in a few minutes' time, those fluids go into your digestive system and they're absorbed into your bloodstream. So these fluids being hypotonic will increase the BHP and the water in your bloodstream and will by nature dilute the amount of sodium that you have. So when the fluids travel out of the bloodstream, they travel into the interstitial space first and then into the cells. So what happens to cells in a hypotonic solution? Those cells will bloat. So I wanted to mention that this story probably sounds familiar. This sounds like hypotonic dehydration. It's because we look at this as a perspective of gain. It's what we're gaining. That's why we call it hydration. Whereas hypotonic dehydration is looked at from a perspective of loss. What are we losing in that situation? So here, that's why we talk about hypotonic hydration being a perspective of gaining excess water. Now, the end result of hypotonic hydration and hypotonic dehydration is ultimately the same. We are going to see those cells bloat that are sitting out there outside the bloodstream. The problem with drinking fluids over a short period of time, and I mean a lot of fluids here, is the cells of our body can swell, including those of our brain. So in cases where people have had a lot of fluid over a short period of time, the cell can and the brain can bloat. It can force the brain down toward the foramen magnum opening and shut off vital brain function. So in cases where people drink milk, alcohol, water, any fluid that's hypotonic in a short period of time, we run the risk of actually killing the body because of this inability to filter and get rid of those excess fluids. I'm going to take you over to page 124 in a separate video. We're going to work through those 10 practice problems on page 124, so look out for my next video.